Hello, welcome to Paul and I's first webcast where we're going to be processing current events through the lens of governance. My name is Michael Iannini from PDAcademia, and with me is Paul Smith from the Future Directors Institute. Paul, today we're going to be processing current events around religious freedoms, LGBT, and transgender issues, and specifically how those are impacting our school communities.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, so can you talk us through some of the things that you're seeing in the news?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things really that we've highlighted. One is happening in Australia, where currently there's a law in place that allows religious schools to discriminate against LGBTI teachers and students and expel them or fire them if they come out or not recruit them. And that law is being looked at as being rescinded. One particular party in opposition wanting to rescind it, and it's split the ruling party, the Liberal Party, down the middle, and there's a big debate about it. The other one's coming from America, which is around a transgender student when the school was in lockdown and everybody was sent to the male or female locker rooms. The transgender student was basically kept with the teacher in the gym because they weren't sure where to send the student. And there's been a big thing around from advocacy and rights groups. And again, this again, I think highlights from a school governance point of view, what a tricky space it can be. For example, on one side, you've got the laws, which are often slow to keep up with what is on the other side, cultural change. Then you've got probably your own personal views, around, morality or whatever it happens to be, your own religious views. And then you've also got the collective community views of the body you're actually governing, the school. And so, and you're trying to keep up with policies. So it's a messy situation, all this sort of stuff. And I can only imagine what it must be like for a school governor.
Well, I see it from the school side is I also see three unique sort of issues and sides to it. I mean, number one, you're a school board. You have to really take into account the fiduciary responsibility. So what legislation is going to be dictating how we're going to be governing our schools? So you need to be on top of these issues. And if you're not discussing these issues, why not? And it may not be this particular issue in your country, but what is being talked about in your country, and is your board prepared to change accordingly? But then you also look at the community perspective. So how is our community changing? Are LGBT issues going to impact our teacher recruitment and student enrollment? I go through a number of schools where you don't really see a lot of people or staff being openly I guess gay or in their LGBT rights. They're teachers and they don't want to be treated differently and they act that way. But you also don't see them educating or promoting awareness around it either, especially in the private schools, because how is that community going to respond to them?
There's some sensibilities in there, isn't there, on let's say both sides, to coin a phrase that seems to get used quite a lot.
But if you want the best teachers too, you have to have a fairly inclusive recruitment strategy. And let's not talk about teachers. Let's also talk about governors. You have to be inclusive because we want the best out of our board, right? So how are we talking about these issues? What sort of awareness do we have, and how can we how by being more inclusive can this benefit us, or in terms of our community, if this is something our community is not open about? How do we address it in such a way that we recruit and carry out these discussions in a way that's sensitive to our community's needs, not just now, but 5 or 10 years from now?
It really does highlight the need for the right skill sets on the board when you've got all these sort of issues. Boards are still trying to keep up with social media policies and a whole bunch of different things as well. And they've got these policies coming up as well. Like, you made a point beforehand about you find a lot of boards, whether it's schools or other types of organizations, that can be very localized in their focus and say, well, it's not happening in Hong Kong, it's not happening in America, it's not happening in Australia or New Zealand, then that's not relevant to me. Yep. But I think what happens in one place can reflect and start being discussed in other places, and it may have already been discussed, and it's just bouncing around because these things become hot because humans are everywhere, regardless of the sort of the cultural issues. Sometimes some countries, they might not talk about certain things like this, but they'll be talking about other things. So what's really interesting to me, apart from like having the right types of people on the board in terms of, you know, you want people with legal expertise to understand your position, where you actually sit, what you can and can't do. Because so many boards make mistakes because they don't understand what their regulatory and legal duties are. Plus, I think you need some sort of like societal, cultural, you know, sort of expertise, or at least people who are really good at grasping the concepts and asking the right questions. They're almost like an ethicist. You know, they're really good at asking the right questions rather than coming up with moral arguments either way. And I think with all this sort of complex society we've got going on, so many different groups have got voices increasingly now. You need to look at who's in your group, but also you've got so many issues. Where do you find the time?
Yeah, and I think that's the power of a board, though, because within that board and its diversity as well, you'll have people attending to different issues and tracking different trends. You know, it wasn't too long ago that schools got caught off guard, and I'm talking about international schools and independent schools got caught off guard the last few years about child safety issues because of the number of abuse cases that started surfacing. And then all of a sudden, boards started talking about it. And that was a reaction. But when you actually have a diverse board and everybody has, you know, might be tracking different issues and different needs, they have the power to be proactive and raise those. It just depends on how they do it within their meetings. And then when you start talking about, you know, do we have people that can help us understand our fiduciary or those legal issues around the board, and are we can be protected by it? You know, that's largely the job of a board. They should be tracking these issues. They should be constantly questioning what's going on in our children's safe, and hey, what's our community going to look like 5-10 years from now? And
that's true. They've got no excuse, really.
Yeah. And when we think about the whole LGBT and transgender issues, well, hey, this is something that is now becoming people are much more aware of. They're much more open to. And as they become open to it, you can imagine that effect when you do have a transgender child in your school about, you know, the potential for bullying. Not just the fact that teachers sat there in a gym trying to figure out, well, do they go into the boys' room or to the girls' room?
Yeah, because there was no policy in place.
Yeah, and what's even more ridiculous is this was a lockdown drill about a potential assailant roaming the school, because this is in the US, right? A potential assailant roaming around the school with a gun, and there we are in the gym, while everybody else might be locked into a locker room safe. This poor transgender child with the teachers are kind of left as open targets, because, well, what do we do?
And the teachers also in the firing line, because they're told you will one child come, and it's just, the whole situation is ridiculous. But again, as you said, the board's responsibility is to discuss these issues, however difficult they might be to talk about it. But I often find boards, they just get stuck into the minutiae of, you know, everyday stuff. And I think we mentioned in a webinar we had recently, like, about how the turnover of heads of schools and principals is quite high now, like, you know, averaging around just under 3 years. And so the board, never before has the board been so important for that medium to long-term viewpoint. And so not just the sustainability of a school, but also these things that are coming up, and they've got to keep an eye on this stuff, or at least have some sort of structure in place or process in place to make sure they keep an eye on it. Now, we've talked about committees in the past, you know, having a committee potentially dedicated to these sort of, like, you know, these things that are coming up.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at, well, you know, you have these various subcommittees or whatnot, but there definitely has to be a forum where we can have generative conversations around what's happening in the world. And how is that, well, not just in the world, but hey, what's happening in our community, what's happening in our city, what's happening in our state, what's happening in our country. That's going to influence the way we work with our communities now and in the next 10 years. And I always like to set that 10-year bar, because that's what a governor should be really looking at. And knowing that there will be more transgender and LGBT students and staff members looking to join our schools. You know, are you prepared for that? And if you're not, well, what should your policies be around admittance and hiring? And can you have policies around admittance and hiring? Because I don't think you or I are advocating for one or the other, but from a board side, if you're not ready for it and it comes, there could be much worse issues that you end up having to deal with. Like I said, it can completely devolve into bullying and other types of, potential lawsuits that.
Well, exactly. I was going to say lawsuits. And also when you're trying to deal with something reactively instead of proactively, that's when mistakes happen.
Yeah.
And so strategically, if one of the board responsibilities is strategy, then you've got to get in front of these things and have what could be very, difficult or could be really easy conversations. From a practical point of view, though, sort of what would be best practice for a school when it comes to, I don't mean in terms of the actual policy setting, but in terms of the processes they can go through to come up with, what they're going to do, how they're going to approach this sort of side of things.
So here's an interesting one. So we look at the, school boards are maybe meeting once a month, maybe, every 6 weeks or whatnot. Subcommittees could be meeting once a month, but let's find an agenda item. Let's stress test. What do we understand about this particular issue? And what kind of ideas can we surface, or questions are we going to be surfacing around how it's going to impact our school? So we talk about transgender issues in bathrooms. Whether it be a subcommittee or a committee, I think for sure there's about a 30 to 45 minute structured conversation around, all right, so first, is this present in our community right now? Is it something there that we're aware of? And I think most schools would be able to say, yeah, we do have LGBT staff or potentially students. Are we aware of it? Should we be aware of it? Those questions alone as well can probably surface a lot of great insights into what you need to know about your own community, because hopefully you do know about the community. Next, let's start processing it through the fact of, all right, well, how do we protect these members of our community? In relation to, all right, the school shooting issue. What do we do, and how does that impact our policies, to our cyberbullying policy, to our child protection policy? So again, schools should have a very good idea in terms of the policies they have and how it influences their students and their staff and their families. And then if you want to stress test it, all right, let's throw in the LGBT question. Does this equally and adequately apply to those members of our community? And that would be my, I would say the first step is just stress testing it in terms of what we know about our community and the policies that we have.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think would be useful to do with this too is to bring in some third-party expertise in some way. Either it's someone who can facilitate a discussion, or it's someone who is an expert in terms of LGBTI children, or how to have those conversations, or the different aspects of it. Because you talk about, is it present in our community? I think it's present in most communities. It's how overt is it, how conspicuous it is. Again, some communities are far more open than others, and it's likely that we may or may not get more or less, but it's probably already there. It's just how open are people with it. And again, if schools, I personally feel, should be inclusive places. So again, if you create a culture where allow people to, let's say, come out if they haven't already come out, or whatever it happens to be, that's also part of the policy setting, is what's the culture we want to have. And again, going back to this initial discussion, when it comes to religious schools, and again, the different guidelines can apply.
Yeah,
and as well,
the board sets the standard too, because if the board is capable of having these conversations and guiding the community in terms of how they should be talking about it, you have a really positive impact on the staff and the students. And I'll give you a really great example that I can end on in terms of what we're talking about. Having a dinner party last night, some friends of ours came back from Denmark, and we were talking about school governance and schools in particular trying to force inclusion, where as opposed to what we were used to in the past, where students with special needs would be pulled out of a room, they were actually being actively taught with differentiated techniques in the room. But unfortunately, very few teachers are capable of really addressing that. And so it creates a distraction for a lot of students across the classroom. And in one particular case, or in this particular case, they had two sons, one son in one grade level and the other in the other grade level. The one son had a very good teacher at being able to address this, and the other son, unfortunately, did not have very good teachers that could do this type of inclusive environment. So it was interesting because the mom said, it impacted the older son's learning because the teachers didn't know how to deal with it. But she said the younger son had the most transformative sort of, I'm trying to think of what her exact words were, but to describe the experience, the younger son was inviting over one of the children to his house for a play date that had these special needs. I think it was attention deficit disorder, potentially high on the spectrum. And because the way the son described the play date, the son, and he's like 6, 7 years old, says to his mom, now look, my friend is coming over and you're going to have to, don't yell at him. Don't tell him to do things. He's different from me, but he's still a very fun, capable boy. You just need to think about how you're going to give him instructions and to not be overly, to not try to overly discipline him. So if he's not responding to something, just be patient, take a breath, and calm down, and he'll respond better to that. And that's a 7-year-old telling that to his mom. And that 7-year-old was instructed that by the teacher who was hopefully in some way supported in either through training or provisioning by senior management. And senior management was able to understand they needed to provision these resources because guess who's the one that's looking out for all of that? That's the board.
It's really interesting, and I think this is, as you say, a great place to close and think about next month's webcast, but videocast, because I think becoming a teacher is becoming harder and harder. It's no longer about just teaching math or science or whatever it happens to be, just teaching the subject anymore. You are a combination of social worker, quasi-parent, negotiator, ethical teacher as well. And it's getting harder and harder, but are we actually incentivizing people to become teachers these days? It's like a lot of industries like nursing, they're hammered because they get a lot of holiday, which they don't do, by the way. They just don't have to be teaching at that time. They're learning and setting stuff up. But, it's a hard job being a teacher, and you're not paid equivalent to that. And it's really interesting, given the fact that we think about kids are our future. Shouldn't it be the most important part? And I've got a lot to say about that probably next time. But just a quick thing, something else that's happening in the news here in New Zealand is there's a massive teacher shortage, and maybe that's something we can talk next time about, how hard it is to find great teachers who can do what this great teacher in Denmark was obviously doing, which would virtually live within this new school rule. Like, it's great putting rules down, but when you've got humans that are potentially not trained to implement those rules, problems arise.
Yeah, and bring it back to the board. If the board's looking out 5 to 10 years from now, it shouldn't be something that management reports to the board saying, hey, we got a teacher shortage. The board should already be prepared for that teacher shortage and consulting their management on how to address it and start capacity building in that respect. And again, if I wanted to relate it back to today's topic, hey, do you need to be much more inclusive than in your recruiting strategies? And by doing so, inviting in much more openly aware and people that are LGBT and hey, I'm still struggling with this type of conversation because I don't have it enough. But this is something that governance needs to get ahead of. Paul, thank you so much for engaging this conversation with me and helping me make sense of it. And hopefully by the next time we talk, not only I'll be more aware of it, but I'll know how to address it and speak about it openly as well. And I look forward to rejoining you.
Okay, goodbye, and can't wait till next time. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Paul. Have a good one. Bye-bye.